There is a route on Kilimanjaro that only the truly desperate choose to take. Among local guides, it has a dark and sinister reputation, and most tour operators actively discourage tourists from attempting it. Yet in September 2015, a young couple from San Francisco who had sold everything they owned to embark on a round-the-world adventure deliberately picked exactly this path. What unfolded over the next 72 hours on the slopes of Africa's highest mountain would shock the world and force everyone to ask one haunting question. Where exactly is the line between a dream and reckless madness? Scott Dinsmore was one of those rare people who could make others believe in themselves. Tall, with an open smile and contagious enthusiasm, he possessed a special gift, the ability to find a spark in a stranger's eyes and fan it into a roaring flame. In 2010, after several years trapped in the soul-crushing routine of a Fortune 500 corporation, Scott founded the movement Live Your Legend. The idea was brilliantly simple: help people discover work that truly inspires them and live lives aligned with their deepest passions. Within 5 years, the movement had grown into a global community with 200 local chapters in 57 countries. His TED-style talk on how to find and pursue work you love had already garnered millions of views, and the Live Your Legend local meetups brought together thousands of people around the world. Scott lived by 3 simple principles: self-knowledge, the right environment, and decisive action. "If we don't know what we're looking for," he often said, "we will never find it." But most importantly, he lived exactly what he preached. Chelsea Dinsmore was not merely his wife. She was his equal partner in every dream and every endeavor. They married in 2010, united by a shared philosophy of living without regrets. While Scott inspired crowds from the stage, Chelsea worked tirelessly behind the scenes, developing the community, planning events, and organizing projects. Their relationship was built on mutual support for even the boldest dreams. That is why, in January 2015, when Scott suggested they sell all their possessions and set off on a round-the-world journey, Chelsea agreed without a moment's hesitation. 6 months on the road completely transformed their view of the world. Croatia, Turkey, Morocco, every country became a new chapter in their shared story. They met people, listened to their stories, and photographed sunsets over unfamiliar cities. Scott kept a blog about their journey, sharing every experience with the Live Your Legend community. "We packed our entire lives into backpacks," he wrote, and those words perfectly captured the spirit of their adventure. By September 2015, they had reached Tanzania. Kilimanjaro had been Scott's childhood dream, the highest peak in Africa, 5,895 meters above sea level, a dormant stratovolcano with 3 summits and glaciers lying right on the equator. Unlike technical climbs in the Himalayas or the Andes, Kilimanjaro does not require advanced mountaineering skills. It is a high-altitude trek open to any physically fit person, and tens of thousands of tourists reach the summit every year. But there was one important but. Scott and Chelsea deliberately chose the Western Breach route, the one that experienced guides grimly call bowling for boulders. Instead of the gradual, well-maintained paths of the popular Marangu or Makaim routes, the Western Breach climbs a steep slope through a zone of unstable volcanic rock. It is the shortest way to the summit, but it is also lethally dangerous. In 2006, a rockfall on this exact route killed 3 climbers, after which the authorities temporarily closed it. By 2015, the route had reopened, but with strong warnings about the risks. Scott and Chelsea wanted the silence of the high slopes and the raw challenge of the route. This choice perfectly matched Scott's philosophy: never settle for the easy path, seek out real tests, and live life to the fullest. He had spent his entire life telling people to do the impossible and push beyond their limits. Now it was time to apply those words to himself. On September 4th, 2015, Scott wrote in his blog, "I almost turned down Kilimanjaro because I was afraid of being offline, but that would have been a tragedy." He had no idea that in 72 hours his name would be known to millions around the world, and that their shared dream would forever change Chelsea's life. The base camp at Shira Plateau welcomed Scott and Chelsea with perfect dry season weather. A colorful mix of trekkers had gathered there: French students, a retired German couple, an American photographer. Chelsea stood out with her boundless energy. She photographed everything, joked with porters in broken English, and enthusiastically shared their plans with fellow climbers. Their group was led by a local guide who knew the Western Breach like the back of his hand. He gave the standard safety briefing about altitude risks, the importance of hydration, and the need to stay together. But when he spoke about rockfalls, his face turned deadly serious. "The Western Breach is a special place," he said, looking at the route map. "The stones here have a life of their own. We start very early in the morning, when the cold keeps them in place." Scott nodded and carefully wrote down every recommendation in his notebook. This was exactly the kind of challenge he had been looking for. The first few days of the climb passed like a beautiful dream. The route took them from lush tropical rainforests up into alpine deserts at 4,000 meters. Scott and Chelsea were in excellent physical condition. 6 months of continuous travel had hardened them. By the evening of the third day, they reached Lava Tower Camp, feeling strong and ready for the final push. On September 11th, at Arrow Glacier Camp, a meeting occurred that would change everything. A man with a camera approached their tent and introduced himself. James Bullock, National Geographic photographer. Behind him were dozens of expeditions around the world, including rescue operations in the Himalayas where he had witnessed mountains claim unprepared lives. His team included his partner Dick Stone, who had recently completed emergency medicine training, and 2 experienced climbers from Minneapolis. That evening around the campfire, Bullock shared stories of glaciers and extreme cold, of moments when survival depended on split-second decisions. Scott and Chelsea listened with wide-eyed fascination, sharing their own plans for the next day. Bullock watched them closely and felt a growing sense of unease. Their overconfidence, the slightly clumsy way they packed their gear, their excited talk about the Western Breach. He had seen it all before in people who underestimated the mountain. In their enthusiasm, he recognized his own younger self from 20 years earlier, when he too believed that good fitness and motivation were enough. "Tomorrow will be harder than you think," Bullock said quietly, staring into the flames. He wanted to say more, to warn them more strongly, but he didn't want to ruin their last peaceful evening. The Western Breach forgives mistakes only for the very lucky, and luck in the mountains is never abundant. He could not have known that in a few hours he would become a witness to an event that would shake the entire mountaineering community worldwide. The alarms rang at 2:30 a.m. The temperature had dropped to -5. The air was piercingly cold. In the darkness, the climbers pulled on warm jackets and checked their headlamps. Chelsea zipped up her bright red down jacket, the very same color that would later become a beacon for rescue drones. At 3:30 a.m., both groups began the final ascent. Bullock led the way. 30 minutes behind them followed Scott and Chelsea. The trail had become a narrow ribbon between sharp rocks. To the right rose an almost vertical crater wall. To the left yawned a drop of hundreds of meters. The first 3 hours went smoothly. At altitudes above 5,000 meters, the air was a third thinner. Everyone was breathing hard, but the group moved steadily. Scott walked just behind Chelsea, holding her hand on the difficult sections. They exchanged short, encouraging words. This was their shared moment of overcoming. By 6 a.m., dawn began to break. The horizon lightened, but the sun had not yet risen. Visibility was only a few dozen meters. Bullock's group had moved ahead and disappeared into the mist. Scott and Chelsea were now alone with the mountain. At 6:20 a.m., they reached the most dangerous section. The path ran along a narrow ledge between a sheer wall and a sheer drop. To the left, the slope fell away at a 70-degree angle. To the right loomed a chaotic pile of loose volcanic rock, the very material that made the Western Breach famous as bowling for boulders. High above them, centuries of weathering had turned the slope into a deadly trap. Boulders ranging in size from a fist to a car hung precariously on the edge, held in place only by thin layers of ice and cracks in the rock. Every gust of wind, every rise in temperature, even the vibration of footsteps could become the final push that sent tons of stone hurtling downward. In this place, gravity was not merely a physical law, it was a patient predator waiting for its moment. At 6:30 a.m., the silence was shattered by a sharp metallic crack, the sound of rock splitting. James Bullock, who was 200 meters higher up, instantly understood what was happening. "Take cover!" he shouted to his team, diving behind the nearest boulder. High on the crater wall, a massive slab of rock broke free. A boulder the size of an SUV began its deadly journey downward, followed by dozens of smaller stones. The cascade gained terrifying speed, turning the narrow chute of the Western Breach into a lethal funnel. Scott and Chelsea heard the crack a split second later. They were in the middle of the most dangerous section. Chelsea instinctively pressed herself against the wall. Scott turned toward the sound, looked up, and saw a black mass of rocks hurtling straight toward him. There was no time to react. From the moment of the crack to the impact, no more than 3 seconds passed. Scott managed only to raise his arm in an instinctive attempt to protect himself. The main boulder, now traveling at nearly 40 kilometers per hour, struck him with devastating force. The impact hit his torso, instantly breaking ribs and damaging internal organs. The force was so great that Scott was thrown several meters down the slope. Chelsea spun around at the sound of the impact and saw the nightmare. Her husband lay motionless among the rocks, his body in an unnatural position. His bright red jacket stood out against the gray stones, but there was no movement. For the first few seconds, she could not believe what was happening. Just moments earlier, they had been walking side by side, talking about the views and making plans for the summit. Now Scott was not responding to her screams. Chelsea rushed to her husband without thinking about the risk of further rockfalls. The scramble down to where he lay took several agonizing minutes. She had to carefully climb over sharp debris. When she finally reached him, her heart stopped. Scott was not breathing. His eyes were closed. There was no pulse. Chelsea immediately began CPR. Her hands shook from cold and shock, but she continued the rhythmic chest compressions, desperately trying to restart his stopped heart. "Scott, wake up! Scott!" she screamed, interrupting the compressions with rescue breaths. The guides and porters stood nearby but did not intervene. They understood the severity of the situation better than Chelsea did. A few minutes after the rockfall, Dick Stone from Bullock's group began descending. His recent emergency medicine training might prove critical. The careful descent down the unstable slope took about 10 minutes. Every step risked triggering another rockfall, so he had to move with extreme caution. When Stone finally reached the site, the situation was obvious. The severity of the injuries, the unnatural position, the lack of response, everything pointed to a fatal outcome. But Chelsea continued her resuscitation efforts. Stone gently pulled her aside and quietly explained that there was no hope. The injuries were incompatible with life. Accepting this truth became the hardest moment of Chelsea's life. The man with whom she had shared dreams for 5 years would never open his eyes again. The mountain that was supposed to be the triumphant symbol of their live without regrets philosophy had become the scene of tragedy. High above, Bullock coordinated the rescue operation by radio. Porters from the base camp were already climbing, but they would need several hours. In the meantime, Chelsea could only sit beside her husband's body. She sat on the cold rocks, unaware that in a few days the entire world would be watching how she faced the impossible. James Bullock took charge of the rescue operation, knowing the next hours would be critical. Over the radio, he contacted the Lava Tower base camp, where their expedition's porters were waiting. "We have a major emergency at the 5,200-meter mark," he transmitted, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need immediate assistance for evacuation." On the other end, Augustine Andrigo, the head porter with many years of mountain rescue experience, answered without panic. Only the professional focus of a man who had faced tragedy in the mountains many times before. "We are heading out immediately with stretchers," he replied and began assembling his team. While the porters climbed, Bullock remained at the scene, torn by conflicting emotions. As a photographer accustomed to documenting events, he was struck by the cruel irony. Just yesterday he had warned them of the danger, yet he had been unable to prevent the tragedy. He was worried not only about Chelsea, who sat in silent shock beside her husband's body, but also about the instability of the slope. Every half hour he radioed their coordinates, feeling responsible for the lives of everyone coming to help. By 10 a.m., Andrigo's team reached the site. 8 strong men in trekking boots carried improvised stretchers made from poles and tarpaulin. Their faces showed the grim determination of people for whom mountain rescue was not just a job but a calling. They understood the risks, but they never left anyone on the slopes, alive or dead. The preparation for the descent took an hour and became the most painful moment for everyone present. The porters worked in silence and with deep respect, carefully wrapping Scott's body in a sleeping bag. Chelsea watched every movement as if saying a final goodbye to her husband. For porters lifted the stretcher while the others secured it with ropes. Bullock and Stone helped Chelsea, who moved mechanically but refused to leave her husband's side. The descent to Lava Tower camp became a grueling physical and emotional ordeal. Every 50 meters they had to stop and in those pauses the silence was deafening. The porters called out commands in Swahili in low voices, understanding the sacred nature of the moment. Their physical strength and years of experience were the only things making the impossible possible. The return of Scott's body home took another 8 hours. The porters carried the stretcher in shifts, changing every hour. By evening of September 12th, the caravan reached the road, where an ambulance was waiting. Scott's body was loaded into the vehicle. Chelsea sat beside it. The slopes of Kilimanjaro were now behind them, but the hardest part still lay ahead. At Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center in Moshi, doctors officially confirmed death from blunt force trauma caused by the rock impact. The cause was obvious. No autopsy was required. The process of preparing documents for repatriation began, a procedure that in Tanzania could take several days. Chelsea spent her first night after the tragedy in a hotel in Moshi, unable to sleep. She called Scott's parents in the United States, her own family, and friends from the Live Your Legend community. Every conversation was agonizing. She had to repeat the same terrible news again and again. Her voice broke, and words refused to form sentences. On September 14th, Chelsea flew back to San Francisco, the same airport from which she and her husband had departed 8 months earlier, full of hope for their round-the-world dream. In the arrivals hall, Scott's parents met her with eyes red from crying. William Dinsmore hugged his daughter-in-law tightly and said in a trembling voice, "He lived more in his 33 years than many people do in a lifetime." The family decided to remember Scott not as a victim of tragedy, but as a man who had managed to live his dreams to the fullest. News of the death of the founder of Live Your Legend spread across the internet like wildfire. Within hours, social media was flooded with posts of grief and disbelief. The community, which numbered hundreds of thousands of people in 200 cities across 57 countries, felt the loss as a personal tragedy. Bloggers and entrepreneurs inspired by Scott posted tributes one after another. Computer screens lit up the faces of people typing through tears about how one man had changed their lives. Thousands of comments, millions of views. The numbers kept growing, turning into a digital monument to a man who had taught the world to live without regrets. The funeral and memorial service in San Francisco became a celebration of life rather than mourning. Hundreds of people filled the hall. Many had flown in from other states. Chelsea stepped onto the stage wearing the same dress she had planned to wear when welcoming them home. "Scott left us in one of the most beautiful places on earth while doing what he loved," she said. "Our duty now is to continue his work." Within a week, the Facebook memorial group had gathered more than 4,000 members from every continent. The philosophy of Live Your Legend gained new power after the tragedy. But soon Chelsea would realize that this philosophy also had a dark side that Scott had never spoken about. The first months after returning from Tanzania, Chelsea lived as if in a fog. Every morning she woke up thinking Scott was beside her, and every morning she relived the shock of reality. Simple things: the smell of the coffee he loved, the sound of phone notifications, the empty side of the bed, became painful reminders. Friends and therapists advised her to give herself a year to heal, but grief does not follow a schedule. Chelsea signed up for mindfulness courses and began keeping an emotion journal, learning to analyze her thoughts before reacting to them. She made lists of triggers: seeing a couple holding hands on the street, hearing a man's laugh that sounded like Scott's, mentions of Africa in the news, even certain songs from their shared playlists. For every trigger, she created a coping strategy: breathing exercises, mantras, shifting attention. The hardest part was the guilt. Chelsea was tormented by questions. Why did she survive and Scott did not? Was it right to insist on that route? Could she have done something differently? A therapist helped her understand that survivor's guilt is a normal reaction, but that knowledge did not make it easier. After 6 months, Chelsea made a decision that surprised everyone. She would continue the journey alone. Her first trip was to Bali, where she spent a month in a yoga retreat, meditating at sunrise and crying at sunset. Then Vietnam, where she rode a motorbike along mountain roads, feeling both freedom and the sharp pain that Scott was not there to see those views. Every journey became therapy, a way to answer the question, who was Chelsea without Scott? By the end of the first year, she realized that the Live Your Legend community needed a leader just as much as she needed purpose. Hundreds of letters from people inspired by Scott, meetups in 200 cities that could fade without coordination. All of it required attention. Chelsea started small, answering emails and coordinating local events, gradually understanding that continuing Scott's work was not a betrayal of his memory, but a way to keep her connection with him alive. The first year was simply survival, Chelsea later recalled. I woke up every day and asked myself how I would get through one more day without him. But gradually I realized that the best way to honor those I love is to become the best version of myself. And the best version of me included everything Scott had taught me. Paradoxically, Scott's tragedy only strengthened the influence of his philosophy. The phrase, "live your legend," took on new meaning. It was now backed not only by inspiring speeches but by the real price sometimes paid for dreams. Scott's TED Talk continued to gain views, reaching 5 million. Chelsea began speaking regularly at events, sharing her own journey through grief to a new life. Her story resonated with people who had lost loved ones and with those who were afraid to take risks for their dreams. International media covered the story as an example of how one person can touch millions of lives. Critics of the "live without regrets" philosophy called the tragedy the inevitable result of recklessness, but such voices were few. Most saw in Scott's story a reminder of the value of every single day. By 2020, Chelsea began to feel emotional burnout. Running Live Your Legend alone demanded enormous energy. In 2022, she honestly announced her decision to focus on her own life. "Living without regrets now means giving myself permission to be selfish," she said. "The right to focus on myself." By 2024, the Live Your Legend website had stopped updating. Scott's death did not lead to the closure of the Western Breach route, but it triggered a chain of changes in the mountain tourism industry. Tanzania's largest tour operators revised their safety protocols. The company Task Trails made protective helmets mandatory for the Western Breach. Other operators followed suit. Pre-climb briefings now included photographs of the accident site and detailed explanations of the risks. James Bullock became an unofficial ambassador for safety on Kilimanjaro. In interviews, he tirelessly repeated, "The Western Breach is bowling for boulders, where climbers are the pins." His articles in specialized magazines and speeches at conferences saved dozens of lives by convincing beginners to choose safer routes such as Mach Aim or Marangu. In mountaineering clubs around the world, Scott's story became a classic example of how underestimating risks can lead to tragedy. Instructors showed photographs of the Western Breach and emphasized the importance of gaining experience gradually. "Mountains do not forgive overconfidence" became a mantra in many climbing schools. Paradoxically, the tragedy did not deter followers of Live Your Legend from adventure. On the contrary, many saw Scott's death as a call to live more boldly, but with wisdom. Discussions appeared in the community about calculated risks and how to distinguish justified courage from recklessness. People began to take preparation more seriously before expeditions, studying statistics and consulting experienced climbers. Scott and Chelsea's story entered psychology textbooks on risk as an example of how charismatic leaders can unintentionally push followers toward dangerous decisions. But the main lesson was different. Dreams are worth fighting for, but wisdom lies in understanding the price you are willing to pay. Almost 10 years have passed since that morning when a metallic crack changed 2 lives forever. Today, Chelsea is an independent woman with her own projects. She works as a coach, helping people navigate crises, travels, and has returned to dancing. In 2025, a book by Scott that Chelsea had prepared was published. It was her way of closing the chapter and letting go of the past. Scott and Chelsea's story forces each of us to ask uncomfortable questions. Was Scott right to choose the dangerous route in pursuit of his philosophy? Or was his death the price of the beautiful words about living without regrets that he spoke so passionately from stages around the world? Today, millions of people follow the advice of motivational speakers. Step out of your comfort zone, take risks, pursue big dreams. It is better to regret what you did than what you didn't do. But who bears responsibility when those calls lead to tragedy? Write in the comments. Are you willing to take risks for your dreams? Or has Scott's story taught you to value safety more than adventure? If you liked this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Ahead of us lie many more incredible and extreme stories. Thank you for watching and see you in the next episodes.